on this Wednesday, the Wednesday before Thanksgiving week. It's hard to believe how fast November is progressing. And next week we celebrate obviously Thanksgiving, but hopefully we get a chance to celebrate family and friends and all sorts of other things as well. So glad you're with us. Glad that you're watching this and being a participant with us here on our table page. I always say too, if you have a question, if you hear anything in these conversations at the table, please feel free to leave a question in the comments or send us an email or send us a message through Facebook or even through YouTube, and we'll answer your questions. So that's what we're here for. It is a conversation. We want it to be a conversation at the table. We've been in a Bible binge for the past year, and we're making our way from Genesis to Revelation. We've been doing it for about 12 months. The whole thing's going to take about 14 months, maybe even 15. We're going to do a little bit after the first of the year as well. But it's been a fantastic journey, and I hope that you've been able to participate with us. If you'd like to, it's never too late to start. We have bookmarks, so just again, let us know. I'll make sure that you get a bookmark as well. The question we're asking today in our conversation at the table is, what are you afraid of? What is it that creates fear in you? Today we are in a very little known book of the Bible, and I always say his name is No Name Nahum. We're in Nahum today, and Nahum is one of the forgottens. There are 12 books at the end of our Old Testaments, which occur in the first part of our Bibles, and then you've got the New Testament, which is after Jesus was born, lived, died, was raised from the dead. We got the New Testament that was written. Nahum's one of the 12 in the Old. The Jewish Bibles call it the 12 writings, and it's just one book, and one book has all 12. We've dissected it out, and that started in the first millennia. So that we have 12 books. We call them the minor prophets. There's nothing minor about them. They were all big guys in their own right, but they're minor because they're small books, and again, they all occur in one book, and we've just teased them out into 12 units at the end of our Old Testament. So Nahum is an interesting guy. He was a prophet right around the same, well, later. He was in between like Jonah, and then you get Jeremiah and Isaiah and Ezekiel, guys that were looking at what was going on in the north of Israel, or northern Israel, which were the 10 tribes in the north, and then the southern tribes, which were wrapped up in what we call Judah. Those guys were pretty much prophesying, or they were preaching to the south. But Nahum's one that existed about 150 years after Jonah, and he is preaching against Nineveh, which is kind of interesting. You've got Jonah, who 150 years earlier goes to Nineveh and preaches grace and salvation and repentance, and they embrace God. They embrace the promise. And then 150 years later, though, you got Nahum, and he's not talking much about salvation. He is preaching judgment. Now, an interesting thing about Nahum is his name means comforter, and he was of comfort, because the words that we see here in this very, very small book are of comfort to Israel, because it's aimed at Nineveh, it's aimed at Assyria, and Assyria is the big bad. Assyria has, like I said, already ransacked the northern kingdom of Israel, and they're getting ready to do the same thing, or they're trying to do the same thing to the south. And so Nahum kind of appears between the fall of the northern kingdom and the fall of the southern kingdom. And Nahum comes alongside the people in Jerusalem and says, hey, look, this is what God is going to do to Nineveh. He's providing comfort because they're going to see their enemy destroyed. Now, at the same time, his words match a lot of what the prophets are saying to Israel itself. So all the reasons for Nineveh's judgment then become reasons for Israel's judgment later. But we're going to look at Nahum today a little differently. We're going to myth bust Nahum 1:3, but this is how Nahum starts. And everything that follows these first 3 verses, basically, these are a summary of everything that follows in this book. So the first 3 verses, the Lord is a jealous and avenging God. The Lord takes vengeance and is fierce in wrath. The Lord takes vengeance against his foes. He's furious with his enemies. The Lord is slow to anger, but great in power. The Lord will never leave the guilty unpunished. Now, before we say anything about the last phrase there, we're going to remind ourselves that reading a prophet, we read this, we think the Lord is a jealous and avenging God. That's the God that Nahum is providing. And we could put all sorts of caricature stuff like that's the God of the Old Testament. And we hear that from time to time. But the Lord is jealous and avenging. He takes vengeance. He's fierce in his wrath. He takes vengeance against his foes. He smashes his enemies. He crushes them. And we come to this and we read this and we do this with all the prophets. So you're probably going to get sick of me saying this, whether it's here in a conversation at the table or a Bible Talks on Sunday. That's not how we're supposed to. When we read these prophets, we're not supposed to think that God is going to smash the United States if we don't toe the line. Or God is going to smash North Korea. God is going to smash Iran. Or God is going to smash Russia. Whatever. You insert anything. That is not how we're supposed to read the Old Testament. These prophecies were given to Israel. The judgment language here is primarily, again, this is for Nineveh, it's for Israel. It's judgment language in broad generalities, but it's all saying something about our salvation. This is all a picture of what happens in our salvation. Are the nations going to be judged? Yes, of course. But the United States is just one of those. In fact, if you read the entire Bible, the Bible tells us all the nations are going to be judged. All the nations are going to have God crushing and smashing. All the nations. And then it also says all the nations are going to be saved. You got both. God's going to save all the nations. God's going to crush all the nations. So this idea that we can come to these verses and then get some sort of picture for our own, and either some comfort or damnation language, which is typically how we're coming to this. If we're looking for all of this, coming to these passages looking for, oh man, this is just going to happen to our enemies, or this is going to happen to the other guys. This is going to happen. No. That is not how we're supposed to read our Bibles. These salvation and judgment themes that the prophets are talking about, including Nahum, are providing us a big picture of our salvation. The judgment of our sin, the judgment of our enemies, sin, evil, death, and the devil, and salvation for us. Salvation for us, it involves judgment against sin, judgment against evil, judgment against our enemy, which is Satan, and death. That's all salvation for us. And these are providing pictures for us. And it's all happening through stuff that was going on before Christ was born in a little tiny nation over on the east side of the Mediterranean, Israel. But to extrapolate all this other stuff, no. This is a window into our salvation, how salvation works. In fact, Israel's being saved in Nahum. Remember how I said this is comfort? God's judgment of Assyria, God's judgment of Nineveh is going to be salvation for Israel. That's a comfort. That's the good news. Good news for Israel. Good news for us is that our enemies are going to be crushed, that God is defeated. And that all happened at the cross. That's the other thing going on. That all of this judgment language in the prophets lands on Jesus. And it's a picture of all the stuff that was going down at the cross at the time. So you want to talk about vengeance? That happened at the cross. You want to talk about how God crushes? That happened at the cross. It's a picture. I mean, it's a sobering picture of the judgment that landed on Jesus and not us. And that's how we're coming around to this. And by the way, Nahum then is talking about a coming person. There is a divine warrior figure in Nahum that shows up, and he starts doing all sorts of things. That's another thing going on in the prophets. Anytime God is acting much like a human, like he is throwing wind or he's swinging a sword. That's meant to help us see something about the incarnation. That God is going to take the form of a person. There is going to be a divine warrior who is going to come and save us from our enemies. In fact, Nahum 1:15. Look to the mountains, the feet of the herald who proclaims peace. Well, who's that talking about? Well, it's talking about Nahum, because he's doing that for Israel. But it's also talking about one that's coming. Celebrate your festivals, Judah. Fulfill your vows, for the wicked one will never again march through you. He will be entirely wiped out. That's the divine warrior for his people. Again, that happened at the cross. Were the Assyrians wiped out? Oh, sure. But it's also anticipating Jesus completely wiping out our sin, completely wiping away the devil and crushing the devil in defeat at the cross. And then the ultimate consummation of all that is at the final resurrection. All that brings us back to Nahum 1:3. The Lord will never leave the guilty unpunished. Now, if you've been part of some evangelism programs or you've done things like the Romans Road, you probably have quoted Nahum 1:3. And I heard that verse all my life, that God never lets the guilty go unpunished. And we use that to try to scare people, scaring people out of hell and into heaven. And it's a popular thing to do. But it's also taking this verse out of context. Is it true that the guilty will always that the guilty will always be punished? Well, sure. But the problem's not what, it's who. First off, who are the guilty in this verse? Now, if we read the rest of Nahum, in Israel, if they're hearing this in 600 BC, they're thinking of the Assyrians. God's not going to let them off the hook. But if we look at the broader context, and if Israel is honest with themselves and they start reading Nahum and they start looking at why God is judging Nineveh, well, then pretty soon it becomes evident that Israel is also guilty here. It's not just the Assyrians. Who are the guilty here? The reality is the guilty includes Israel because the guilty include everybody. Everybody's guilty. When someone's quoting this verse in this way, especially in, again, scaring people, trying to scare people out of hell, typically it's done from the standpoint of an us versus them mentality. There is no us versus them here. It's just them. Or us. It's all of us. We're all guilty. We're all guilty. I want to know, when somebody's quoting that verse, just who that person thinks is not guilty. Do they think they aren't guilty? Well, no. I mean, are we not guilty because somehow we repented? Are we not guilty because we said the sinner's prayer? Are we not guilty because we got saved? No, we're always guilty. Always. Even in sanctification. There's never a moment that none of us aren't guilty. I hear it all the time, and you see this on the internet, and I've seen it on the internet, sure, in the past week. God doesn't clear the guilty. Nahum 1 is quoted, as well as some other verses, and oh boy, wait till they see what's going to happen to them. They're going to get theirs. How many times have you heard somebody say, man, when that guy dies, he sure got something coming? What? Again, us versus them. There is no us versus them. We're all guilty. We're all sinners. The us versus them is just a terrible way to live. It's a terrible world life view. And it lacks grace. It lacks Jesus, quite frankly. But then there's this. The guilty will never be punished. You and me. Want to know why? Because all of that judgment landed on Jesus. The guilty go unpunished all of the time. All the time. Back yesterday, I probably sinned 100 times yesterday, and 100 times I wasn't punished. You want to know why? Because that punishment landed on Jesus. And it landed on Jesus for me. It landed on Jesus for the guy that I think I'm talking about. Once and for all, Jesus was the guilty party who was punished. And he was punished even though the guilt was really ours. So we don't have to live in fear of this. This is really my point. I heard that so much that over time I began to believe I was the one that was guilty. And that I should fear God's punishment. And again, a terrible way to live because it's not true. God's not going to punish me. He's already punished Jesus. I don't have to live in fear of that. I can live in the freedom that Jesus, because he's been punished as the guilty one, he gives me freedom to go free. That's not fair. It wasn't fair to Jesus. We don't need fairness. But Jesus was punished as the one who was guilty, and the guilty, I went free. So, that's how we live. That's how we live out our lives. And again, I want to emphasize this is true for Christians as well as non-Christians, all of this stuff, because we're still guilty. We're still sinners. Yes, we have been saved. Yes, we've been regenerated. But that doesn't make us any less sinner. Doesn't make us any less guilty of sin and in need of, doesn't make us any less in need of Jesus in those moments. So, here's the other thing too. It's not fear of hell. It's not fear of punishment that connects people to Jesus. It's God's kindness, the New Testament tells us. It's God's kindness that leads us to repentance. It's God's kindness that pulls people to himself. It's his grace and forgiveness. So, we should be talking about the beauty of who Jesus is. If somebody doesn't know Jesus, they need to know how beautiful Jesus is for them. They need to know that Jesus was punished on their behalf. Sure, they need to know about sin, but I need to know about sin. I need to know about the sin of my life. And as we hear about sin, it drives us to Jesus, to embrace him in faith. And it's the beauty of what Jesus has done for us that connects us to himself. And so, I encourage you, as we read through Nahum, as we read through all these judgment passages, we begin to see that this is what Jesus went through for us. This is who Jesus is for us. Here's the other thing too. In the context of God never clearing the guilty, here's a verse that we're never told is in Nahum. This is Nahum 1:7. The Lord is good, a stronghold in the day of distress. He cares for those who take refuge in him. See, that's hope. That's grace. That's good news. The Lord is good. He's a stronghold in a day of distress, and every day is a day of distress, if we're honest. So, Jesus cares. Jesus is good, and he's good for you, day in and day out, all day long. That is our conversation at the table. And I hope that you have benefited from this. Again, if you've got questions, leave them in the comments. Hope you're having a great day. We will continue this tomorrow on another conversation at the table as we continue to make our way through the Bible binge. And we'll probably talk about some other stuff along the way as well. Again, I hope you have a great rest of your Wednesday. And remember this, that you can rest and have confidence in Jesus, who loves you and who cares for you.